I will be talking about the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro. Your assignment is to copy down the information to your notes, making sure to capture the main ideas and major details. Cuba was a Spanish colony. The first Spanish settlement came in 1511. The Cuban people were taken over by the Spanish, similar to how people were taken over in Africa and in Asia by Europeans who had more firepower and the ability to exploit that firepower to gain access to natural resources. Cuba, being a hot and humid country, sugarcane became the main export, and Cuba slowly grew into a large world supplier of sugarcane, making up an increasingly large percentage of their economy. The people in Cuba were certainly not happy about the situation. In 1868 and 1879, Cuba made attempts, eventually unsuccessful, to gain their independence from Spain. In 1895, another attempt at independence began, and in that fight, by 1898, the United States joined the war on the side of the Cubans. The United States claimed that we were there to support their freedom and independence, much like the United States in the 1700s fought for freedom and independence from Great Britain when we were a colony. By December of 1898, Spain gave up control of Cuba. When this happened, the people of Cuba hoped that they would be free and they could truly rule themselves without any interference from outsiders. But the United States began by ruling Cuba through a military government. In 1902, the United States granted Cuba their freedom, but they still were very involved. The U.S. was still allowed to intervene, particularly in economic or foreign affairs. Many American companies, especially agricultural and sugar companies, were still operating in Cuba. The United States had invested a lot of money inside of Cuba and was making a lot of money off especially their sugarcane farms and their sugar factories. And so the U.S. kept people in Cuba to help keep control. In 1933, a man named Fulgencio Batista came to power in Cuba after a massive labor strike motivated by government corruption. During his 26-year rule, Batista implemented some progressive social and economic reforms to help the poor, but he later suspended these. Government corruption and brutality grew over time during his administration. The number of American companies operating in Cuba, particularly in the sugar industry, also grew. And the U.S. supported Batista until 1958, despite the increasing brutality from his leadership. Once again, the people of Cuba were not happy with the situation, and on July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro, who was educated as a lawyer and became part of a group critical of Batista, led an attack on the Masada Army barracks. The group became known as the 26th of July movement. Its goals were to overthrow Batista and carry out progressive reforms in Cuba. Castro was arrested and put in jail. He was released in 1955, and he moved to Mexico to continue building support for his movement against Batista. In 1956, Castro and other members of the 26th of July movement snuck back into Cuba and established a base in the mountains. They quietly worked to build more support among the Cuban people. Starting in August of 1958, Castro's armies surrounded major cities and cut off railroads and supply lines. On December 31st, Batista fled Havana, the capital city, and Castro took power. The Eisenhower government recognized Castro as the new leader of Cuba in April of 1959. And in April of 1959, Castro visited the United States and met with Vice President Nixon. Relations between the United States and Cuba quickly soured. The U.S. grew skeptical of Castro. Castro banned foreign ownership of land in Cuba. He wanted his own people to be able to make money off of their natural resources instead of having other countries making money off of them. But remember that many American companies owned agricultural land there and were making a lot of money. Castro also took over privately owned businesses. Again, saying that the Cuban people should be the ones making the money from these businesses, not outsiders. In October of 1960, the United States placed an embargo on Cuba. What this meant was Americans were not allowed to sell anything to Cuba except food and medicine. We were also not allowed to trade or travel with them. So you could not go directly to Cuba, and this was the case until Barack Obama became president. In April of 1961, the CIA funded an invasion of Cuba to try and overthrow Fidel Castro. This is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA-backed forces were quickly defeated by Castro's army, making the United States look very foolish that a small, very poor country was able to defeat the far more heavily armed and advanced United States. That's it for notes. For the remainder of this lesson, you will be looking at the question, how did Fidel Castro view the United States? You'll have a timeline and readings, which you'll use to complete a graphic organizer, and analysis questions. You can always reach out to me via email or texting if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.